Several years ago, I picked up In Praise of Shadows, an essay by Japanese author Jun'ichirō Tanizaki. Now it feels more relevant than ever. As our world lurches from chaotic event to chaotic event, it's nice to focus on Tanizaki's ideas around caring about the simple things, the small beauties of our natural environment, and the ways of seeing through the darkness. This is the world of Jun'ichirō Tanizaki. Tanizaki has a masterful way of evoking atmosphere with his words. His prose is imbued with sensory delights. The sight of a flickering candle, the sound of rustling silk, and the smell of incense burning in a dimly lit room. When he writes about a traditional Japanese home, he transports us there. Whenever I see the alcove of a tastefully built Japanese room, he writes, I marvel at our comprehension of the secrets of shadows, our sensitive use of shadow and light. For the beauty of the alcove is not the work of some clever device. An empty space is marked off with plain wood and plain walls, so that the light drawn into its forms dim shadows within emptiness. There is nothing more. And yet, when we gaze into the darkness that gathers behind the crossbeam, around the flower vase, beneath the shelves, though we know perfectly well it is mere shadow, we are overcome with the feeling that in this small corner of the atmosphere, there reigns complete and utter silence. That here in the darkness, immutable tranquility holds sway. If there is an essential Tanizaki thesis, it is in this deliberate contrast between absence and presence. His work features the distinction between modernity and tradition, the haunting of the old world against the brashness of the new, the depth found in the simple and the unadorned, and the changes of time that shift our perspectives and culture. This includes a reaction against the encroachment of Western-styled architecture, the invasion of electrical light bulbs, or the relentless pace of modernization. Much of the essay focuses on the distinction between this Eastern and Western aesthetic. In the opening, he writes that Japanese culture has its own unique appreciation for absence, contrasting this against the Western ideal of constant, never-ending upward progression. We tend to seek our satisfactions in whatever surroundings we happen to find ourselves, he writes, to content ourselves with things as they are. And so darkness causes us no discontent. We resign ourselves to it as inevitable. If light is scarce, then light is scarce. We will immerse ourselves in the darkness and there discover its own particular beauty. But the progressive Westerner is determined always to better his lot. From candle to oil lamp to gaslight, gaslight to electric light. His quest for a brighter light never ceases. He spares no pains to eradicate even the minutest shadow. This was 1933 in Japan, a country which had yet to undergo the radical transformation and acceleration experienced in the ensuing decades. 60 years later, Japan would be the epitome of this Western-style culture that Tanizaki describes. In the 80s and 90s, Japan was the center of technological innovation and progress, the heart of the robotics boom, and the push towards modernization, globalization, and futuristic technological developments. So much so that it inspired a lot of popular Western sci-fi films like Blade Runner. At that point in time, the East Asian modernism was seen as the future of civilization. It was hardly the dark, candle-lit place that Tanizaki describes of the 1930s. At the same time, this cultural distinction between Eastern and Western culture has often been repeated. Eastern cultures are often represented in our films and novels as focusing on absence, death, and loss, while Western culture is typically stereotyped as focusing on achievement, presence, and accumulation. These ideas can be nestled rather neatly into the history of Western philosophy, which is centered in the canon on what it means to exist, to be or not to be, and what it means to live a good life. Byung-Chul Han, the German philosopher, in his book Absence, tackles this distinction head-on. In promoting the book, he writes, "Western thinking has long been dominated by essence, by a preoccupation with that which dwells in itself and delimits itself from the other. By contrast, Far Eastern thought is centered not on essence, but on absence. The fundamental topos of Far Eastern thinking is not being, but the way, Tao, which lacks the solidity and fixedness of essence. The difference between essence and absence is the difference between being and path, between dwelling and wandering. A Zen monk should be without fixed abode, like the clouds, and without fixed support, like water," said the Japanese Zen master Dogen. Han draws on Tanizaki to emphasize his point, that absence is not just the lack of something, but the presence of something bigger than oneself. "The good wanderer leaves no trace," he says, quoting Levi. In some ways, this means that absence, darkness, and loss are character building, or in another sense, shape who we go on to become in our lives. The world is constantly changing, Tanizaki tells us, but it is in our preservation and appreciation of traditional artwork and architecture and the shadows of the past that we can find ourselves. There's still a strong sense of this in some Japanese culture. Modern Japan has faithfully kept in place several heritage buildings and architectural styles that date back hundreds of years, evoking a past that is seemingly lost to us today. And at the same time, Japanese culture continues to focus on various forms of absence, loss, and grief, typified in some of the most popular forms of media that reach the Western market. It's very popular for video essayists to talk about the concept of ma, the Japanese concept, which represents a gap in time or empty space. In a very similar way, a pause in between the action. Studio Ghibli films often feature ma, that is, characters pausing in a particular moment of contemplation or silence in between the loud edges of the action. This is clearly shown in the popular film Spirited Away, where the protagonist catches a train ride in silence with her ghostly companion. In this way, the traditional form of Japanese shadow has transformed into the new medium of film, creating the same gap or absence that was there in the past. Although the cultural shift Tanizaki was working against has been lost, Japan has modernized and become the modern powerhouse that he perhaps feared it would become. It still retains at least a semblance of the cultural aesthetic he described.